Loving God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, for you are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. When I read a passage like this one in Luke, and we have Jesus telling a humorous parable, one that always brings back to mind my own behavior or the behavior of persons in my life's journey, I smile and I understand what it means to relate to how common Jesus was in his outreach to everybody. And I think about going back to the little country church that I grew up in, and there was a marvelous couple. They were good through and through and through. And they ran the church school, worked hard in that setting, and did anything anyone might ask them to do in a volunteer capacity. But the wife, her name was Susie, would often say something like, well, you know, they haven't been in church in 3 weeks. I wonder what's going on in that household. And then she might say, well, I can't imagine. Remember now, this is the 1950s, a much more dressy time. The 1950s, well, they sent their kids to church in blue jeans. Can you imagine? Now, these people, Susie and Lloyd, were just marvelous folk. They would come in and they'd wash the floors and they'd wash the windows and they'd volunteer their time, but they had about them this little bit of a harsh edge, a little bit of judgment. And so you always found yourself tiptoeing around Lloyd and Susie for fear that you were going to get a little zing. And it reminded me when I read the Pharisee, and the Pharisee here, this is so well done the way Jesus does this. The Pharisee in all of his fine robes walks into the temple and says, basically, here I am, God. God, I thank you that I am not like other people. Thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector, looking over his reading glasses at the tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income. And so he was reminding God about how good he was, how good he should be in God's sight. And the tax collector, who wasn't very popular in that day, in fact, come to think about it, tax collectors aren't very popular today either, but the tax collector was a Jewish man who was collecting tribute, taxes, to pay to the Roman overlords, and so he was pretty much regarded as a collaborator with the Romans, kind of like a traitor to the cause. He was funding the very army that was subjugating the Jewish people. And the tax collector, obviously realizing how people felt about him, walks into the temple. I can visualize, kind of stooped. I don't really want to be noticed. I just want to go to a pew in the far back corner, and I want to just offer my prayers and my thoughts to God. And God says, who do you think was more sincere in their heart? And so Jesus tells this story about two very different types of people who bring two very different attitudes into this moment of conversation with God. Now, as I've been thinking about it this week, I've thought, I know people who have that kind of judgmental edge, and I've told you a little bit about Lloyd and Susie. I really liked them. They were good people, but they could zing you. And then there were other people in my life who were very much like the tax collector, who were really very humble, very down to earth, very sincere, who never thought too highly of themselves, and I could name them in my life. But then I also need to think about the fact that those kinds of behaviors are both present in my own life. And we, I think, need to be conscious of that. There are moments, frankly, because we're human, when every one of us looks askance, or we kind of look at someone and we wonder, oh, I wonder what the story is there. Just maybe by the way they're dressed, or maybe by the way they talk, or maybe by the way they do something. And then I'll catch myself and I'll say, why am I thinking that way? I need to have an open mind. It's a little bit like the prayer of invocation that we shared in the beginning this morning. When we look through the window of our lives and we see the people who pass through our lives, is our mind open? Is our heart open as we meet and greet the people who walk into and through our lives? Or do we have a way of pigeonholing, categorizing, thinking maybe this person isn't quite where I am on life's journey? So I think our task as folk who really do care and who really are mostly aware of what we are thinking and feeling and how we're reacting, I think our task is this week, as we live our lives, to be reminded that we have both these people living inside the fabric of our being. We have the Pharisee and we have the tax collector. We have the edge of judgment and we have the humility and compassion. And those human emotions rub together, they churn around inside us, and they are very much a part of how we process the meeting and the greeting that goes on in the living of our lives. When we get into trouble is when we are unaware of those two personalities inside our being. And we kind of allow one or the other to take control. When we are not in trouble, when we are listening, I believe, to God, is when we are completely aware,